Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy these. It's a little respite from the outside world there. And I want to bring in a little bit of the teaching, I guess we can call it tonight, in line with previous weeks while we're going through this pandemic. Just kind of, I guess, survival strategies, if you will, and how to deal with stress and coping with it, and just kind of practical stuff. And I circulated today an article I'd seen out of Harvard by a physician there that talked about how to stay emotionally connected while we're in social isolation. And I thought it was a really important point because so many of us, I think, can conflate or merge the ideas of being alone with loneliness. And that's a reality for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. And I just kind of want to parse that out a little bit and talk about some of the separation between how we can be in these states of social isolation, which I think most of us are. If we're not in actual lockdown, we're certainly limited and spending a lot of time in our homes, sometimes with other people, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. I think there's a lot of issues sometimes with couples these days that are having problems by being stuck in the same house. But that being said, I think there's some tools we can bring into the situation of social isolation so that we don't have to feel quite so disconnected from everyone. So I think I just want to start 3 points. One, the first is just that distinction about the difference between being lonely and alone. And I think, I think the idea of loneliness, which, by the way, I've mentioned here before, is really epidemic in our society. There's a huge amount of loneliness. And I think a lot of the addiction we see, at least certain communities in the country, is about striving for some kind of connection, the sense of being connected. So this is really hard for a lot of people, just kind of being cut off. So that idea of loneliness, and I think we can all understand, we've all probably had the experience of being lonely, even though we're in a crowded room or in a crowd. The size of the crowd or the number of people around us doesn't really translate into whether we feel lonely or not. So loneliness is kind of an inside job. And I think it's not a good feeling. It's something we need to strive to counteract with connection and other tools that we have. However, I think there's a distinction between that and just being alone. And I think there's actually some benefit to being alone sometimes, right? It takes some balance. We don't always be in a state of being alone. But I think it's important for our mental health, it's important for our physical health, our spiritual health, to have time where we can kind of be with ourselves. And many addicts, I think, really try to flee that internal experience. I think a lot of us who have had addiction in our past or in recovery really have used addiction to kind of numb or escape from uncomfortable feelings or thoughts, or just not be with ourselves, just kind of check out of our lives through mood-altering substances or behaviors. So I think the ability to sit with ourselves and be alone, but have it be a productive time or actually a pleasant time is something that's really useful and something to think about. So you might see how you can, or think about how you could create a rich experience even though you may be alone. It might be having quiet thoughts. It may be thinking about memories. It may be enjoying the moment. It might be listening to music. I think these are essential times that allow our brains to kind of process things in an important way where we can really be present with ourselves. And I believe that's very healing. So, this is an unusual situation. We're often trapped in our houses, but I think we can certainly make at least part of the day, make use of the time, because that experience of being with yourself, but not in a panicky, lonely way, but really being with yourself can be quite a wonderful thing. So that's one. The second one is to use that time, if we're by ourselves physically, to think about people that we really care about. And I think, and my point here is that we can experience some of the neurochemicals that are very satisfying and exciting and soothing when we conjure up an image of someone or thoughts and memories of someone, even if they're not in the same room. And an example of that, just today, a friend of mine in DC called, he's writing an article, and he was saying, I miss my mom. And his mom, he's my age, he was no youngster, and his mom died a couple of years ago. But he was saying in these kind of crazy times, he had a good relationship with his mother. He misses her, the comfort that she provided. And so we talked about it, and really, although it would be nice to physically see her, that's impossible. But I think we can also benefit for people, and it may not be our moms or our dads, but we all have somebody in our lives who is there for us and sort of represents or is a symbol of comfort and soothing. And I think if we really kind of connect with them, connect with the memories, connect how it feels to be with them, and kind of invite their, if it can't be their physical presence, their energetic presence into our lives, I think it can really be quite profound. There's somebody once termed this mother hunger, this kind of longing for someone. But I think those relationships, when we think about it, even though they're not present, can be very soothing and really be very powerful, that experience. It's not uncommon in older couples where one passes, the other talks, and kind of, it's a very, very living arrangement, even though the person is not there. It can freak out children of people when they see their living, surviving parent doing that. But it really makes perfect sense in that there's still a richness of that experience, even though the person is physically not there. So I think that's one thing that we can bring in people. Even though we can't physically have people, we can conjure up their image and kind of sit with them in their energy and kind of be with them. And then the third thing that I think is so important, we are not cut off from people. We are physically isolated, but we certainly have a more technological ability to communicate and connect than we've ever had in history. And so I think that idea of practicing outreach and kindness and gratitude, I think gratitude is always the magic formula, the magic element of all this. But if we can kind of practice kindness toward ourselves and toward others, and just little acts of kindness, reaching out, making a call, I think these are the times when people really need it. And I think if we can just remember, one of the tenets of 12-step program is service and kind of carrying the message. And that's so healing for us. And I've talked before about how if I reach out to someone, not only does that person receiving the call hopefully get something from the experience, but I do as well. That idea of service and connecting just is really gratifying. And it's also, by the way, gratifying to be the recipient of a call like that. Just checking in, just no agenda, just checking in, saying hi. So I think, so those things are really important. And there's little techniques that we can use and utilize to just sort of not have to be lonely or so isolated, even though we may be physically isolated. So I guess that's enough of that. So I'll turn it back to Scott, and we can open it up.
Cool, thank you, David. Just a reminder to everybody, ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. That's the easiest way to do it. You can also use the chat feature, but Q&A feature is better. We've got a couple in there already, but I wanted to ask you, David, I wanted to bring up one thing. I was on a webinar yesterday with Jonathan Taylor, and he has young kids and he has siblings who have young kids, and they had a Disney Plus party from all their separate houses because they couldn't be together. So they had like a watch party. They got creative and the kids were FaceTiming each other and the adults were texting, and they all watched the same movie at the same time. That people are finding creative ways to be with other people without actually being there, which I think is really cool. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about, David, is being sort of trapped in the same house with maybe a partner who just betrayed you and you just found out, or a partner who's actively in his or her addiction. What kind of boundaries should be set when you're packed into a house 24/7?
Right. That's a really difficult situation. And it's one that I think a lot of people are finding themselves in right now. So I think, boundaries, I would say physical and emotional boundaries. I think it's really important in a situation like that to have somebody have their space. And if they have that option, the luxury of having enough space where have someone really kind of stays in their room, or people stay in their proverbial corners, and share and have really good boundaries about timing and interruptions and respect for each other's time and feelings. And so I think it's just a matter of communication and conversation and establishing really clear rules to live by in that situation. It's really hard, though, I will say. But I think it's okay to really try to carve out the space to the extent possible, even physically, where people just kind of don't have to bump up against each other if that's possible, all the time when there's those hard feelings. The other thing I would say, if possible, is to kind of defer the heavy-duty conversations and discussions about heavy-duty stuff, because I think it's a high-stress time for starters, but also in this situation, it's really hard if there's hard feelings, or if there's an argument or a serious argument, there's like nowhere to go. And so I think it's really important to kind of maybe just take it a day at a time, a moment at a time, get by, and then wait till things ease up a little bit externally before we get into the really heavy duty stuff and try to resolve things. I think this is more of a holding pattern kind of thing. The other thing I worry about right now is that having addicts trapped in homes with their addictive tools, and I'm thinking of especially porn addicts is really hard because they're there's time, there's sometimes not accountability. And so I think it's really important to step up and use the tools that are out there. I'm sure it's there, the same, Scott, and here, our 12-step programs, there's been like massive effort to move everything into virtual space. And, the people are sending out on Facebook groups and stuff, links to meetings and reminders of meetings. And just, it's been kind of really cool to see. So there are options out there, and there's no excuse really not to stay connected to our program because this is a high stress time. And just the other thing I'll just mention, I think just beware of getting too much caught up in the news. And I'll say I've been guilty of that myself. I kind of realized I was binge watching, CNN or MSNBC and kind of getting myself all worked up, and that's not good. So I kind of set a rule for myself, set little limits, and certainly not in the evening or before I go to bed, because that really just upsets my night. So yeah, little ways to adjust and deal with it, but I think it can be manageable.
Yeah, I agree. I think, but if I had somebody in the house with me, we would have to have boundaries right now, and they would be, okay, you have to just not, I don't want to see you from this time to this time. I mean, literally, I do not want to see you, let alone hear from you. Just because I need space. So, okay, let's get to our questions. Hi, Dr. David and Scott. I have a 5-year-old son. I've been in recovery for about 6 months now. I want to make sure I make lasting attachments with him. Now, with social distancing, we are home for extended amounts of time. I'm able to do my recovery work. I want to know how to make the best of this time for my recovery, my relationship with my son, and my husband. Thanks for everything y'all do.
Wow, great question. And another example of kind of this unusual time we're in with shared space and support. I think one thing, certainly to take care of yourself, right? That's really the primary task here, is to make sure your recovery is solid and you're connected and doing the things you need to do for yourself. In terms of your family relationships, I think with your son especially, 5 years old, kids are really sensitive to the energy around them. And so I would really do everything you can to be reassuring. That kind of, we talked to one of the points was about kind of mother nurturing energy. I think to really be as cognizant of that as you can, of you and your husband are the adults, he's the kid, he's going to be very sensitive. And I think this could be a really beautiful time, an unusual time where you have an intense amount of exposure to each other. And if you can set a guideline of kind of reassurance and safety, I think that's really the best thing you can do. And calling your husband to do that as well. You don't mention your husband, I assume things are good. But, and I have the luxury of just, there's two of us, two adults in my place. And I worry, and not worry, but I understand the difficulties of having children in a place and having you know, because kids have a lot of energy and need to move around. And so I think there's also, you need to find a way to let that happen. If you're in a place where you can go outside safely, I think that's probably a good idea. But to be respectful of the child's needs too, to like move around and figure out how that all works. And the same true, even if things are great with your husband, I think the same goes with boundaries, just to really make it clear kind of when you need time for you, that alone time I spoke of, how you can take care of each other's needs and support each other, but also respect each other's needs. I mean, we all in this country, I think, have very kind of independent lives, and this is a very unusual situation. We kind of thrown together physically and share space in a way that we don't always do. And it's going to be stressful. So I think if we can just kind of be gentle with each other, be kind, be understanding, sometimes be firm if you have to, but kind of help everybody along together. And it can I think, quite be a healing experience.
And you know, you could also do some craft projects and things like that. To, you know, as a kid, he needs to be busy, and you can do that with him. And you know, he'll remember, and you know, make Christmas ornaments, and every year at Christmas he'll remember. You know, things like that. So that's my 2 cents. Next one. Hello, I've been recovering from porn addiction for about 6 months. In this time, I have not masturbated. Congratulations. My libido is considerably lower. I have had trouble maintaining an erection during sex with my wife. I want to have sex with my wife, and I'm very attracted to her. My question is about my arousal template. Is it ruined forever? I am totally turned off by porn and want to experience real sex and grow sexually with my life. With my wife. Thank you for your time. Great question, and a very common issue.
Yeah, indeed, a great question. I was just talking to our clients at Seeking Integrity today about arousal templates. Yeah, so for those that don't know, the quick version, the arousal template is that map in our heads of things, people that we're attracted to, and that really gets kind of hijacked by addiction, especially sex and porn addiction and chemsex, where it escalates because of super stimulation to things that reset the baseline of what we need to be aroused. And there isn't a period of adjustment when we're in recovery of 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer, up to a year maybe, where that really has to come back. We have to let our arousal fall out of these kind of artificially heightened levels due to stimulation from drugs and sex, porn, back to normal levels where we can find pleasure with an orgasm, find pleasure with an emotional connection with our partners, or find pleasure with, you know, the hobbies that we used to enjoy, or our dogs, or, you know, whatever, just to find little things pleasurable again. And so there's a couple of reasons for this, you know, that I mentioned addiction really hijacks it. So it does take time to come down. Part of that is losing the appeal of porn, which you've done, which is fantastic. I think that's a really important aspect of this. The other thing I think is to really work on it in terms of maybe trying it and approaching it in a different way. One of the things I was emphasizing with our clients today is that if we keep old kind of fantasies alive in our arousal template, that'll really delay that process significantly. It slows it down. So we have to kind of abandon those old points that might be exciting still, that are kind of connected with our addiction, and look for other ways to find arousal. But so 2 things. One, to understand it, the brain, when it's dealing with all this super stimulation, it really has a lot of effort at homeostasis. So it'll actually shed dopamine receptors to kind of turn down the volume on this stimulation. And so that takes time to come back in recovery. Once we turn down the volume, the brain doesn't have enough dopamine basically to make us feel good and normal and excited. And it takes a period of months for those things to kind of regenerate and come back. So till our brains are really functioning normally for dopamine. The other thing is kind of to reawaken sex and intimacy with our partners. Sometimes we have been so used to an addictive approach, which is very much in our heads. So I think sometimes our heads kind of are our worst, our enemies, because a lot of sex addiction and chemsex is all about kind of scripts and fantasies and all this kind of head stuff that's not really a connection in an intimate way with our partner. So there's a couple things usually going on. One, we're having to deal with intimacy, trust, vulnerability, on both parts, right? Our partners and the addict really have to deal with some of that. And for many men and women in recovery who have used drugs and sex addictively, having sex without that stuff is really kind of, it's very real and very scary sometimes. It's because most of us, I think, in our addictive careers had only had sex with the benefit of a lot of drugs or a lot of addictive behaviors. So to have it, to be open and vulnerable and in a trusting situation without that takes some work and some effort. The other thing I would suggest is that to approach sex and intimacy, not so much with your head, which is where I was going, but try moving more into body sensations and kind of try to, it's a workaround of our brains, which have kind of taken over in this addictive process, and really explore physically, physical sensations. I think a lot of couples benefit from breathing, doing some really relaxing breathing together even. That 4-7-8 breathing I've talked about a lot here, but any kind of breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth, slowly, repetitively will kind of calm everybody down. There's exercises you can lay against each other, chest to chest, and your heartbeats will start to synchronize. And things like that are just kind of really cool to explore with. And I'll mention there is a Masters and Johnson exercise called Sensate Focus, which is for couples to kind of reignite that intimacy. And it's really about physical exploration and feedback, pleasuring and giving feedback. I like that, I don't like that, back and forth. So there's a lot of ways to do it. If you're in therapy, if you have a CSAT or a sex therapist, talk to them about this. There are some techniques that can help. Thanks.
Yeah, I just popped a link to an article on the website about porn-induced erectile dysfunction. It's really, really common, even among teenagers are experiencing porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And it's, it's got nothing to do, it's not physical, it's, and they don't struggle to get an erection or reach an orgasm when they're looking at porn. But when they go to a real world partner, they struggle. And the, David hit on it. The reason, but it's just, we get so used to that intensity, and a single person, no matter how attractive they are, no matter how much we love them, just can't give that same dopamine rush. So we have to step away from it. The brain has to adjust. It's going to take a while. And when you're in a relationship, you do have to learn the intimacy part of sex, because there is no intimacy with porn. Porn is porn. Another person requires some intimacy. So it's going to take a while. Right. But you're on the right track, and congratulations for 6 months there. That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just say about, male orgasm, it really all starts in the brain, and the brain has to be excited enough, and then it sends messages down to your groin, basically, and that's where things happen. But even like drugs like the erectile dysfunction drugs like Viagra and Levitra, they only work if certain chemicals have been stimulated already. And so if a lot of times those drugs don't work so well when we're in the situation with our brains kind of needing this hyperstimulation that we're not getting. So sometimes those don't even work. It's all about letting the brain relax and just kind of getting into the physical experience.
Okay. Next question, boundaries. I'm finding it difficult to provide the support I want to give my spouse, as he is feeling a great deal of justified anxiety about the crisis, specifically around travel, which is absolutely necessary for this person's job, without either crossing codependency boundaries or triggering resentments, which are pulling me toward addictive behaviors. Any tips for me?
Well, I mean, boundaries are really the key to recovery in that sense. And so I think I would say boundaries and communication. So I think to really be clear on, first of all, what you're feeling and needing, and being able to communicate that and establish boundaries that are manageable and workable, and that can be respected by both parties. So I think it's really just a matter of figuring out what you want, what you need, and starting to communicate that. And sometimes they can be negotiated to some extent, sometimes not, but to really kind of sort of look at it as a contract. And these are things that are important and necessary and that, like any kind of sexual recovery plan, maybe they need to be adjusted, but that requires agreement and conversation and dialogue and further discussion. But I think there's an integrity piece here that is so important on the part of the addict to sort of make these agreements, respect the boundaries, and follow through. And there's a willingness. I mean, there's a lot of elements here. We often get comments in the chat where the partners are not willing to really do this, or in kind of in denial, or rationalizing, or making excuses, and you know, that's not helpful. And so I think it really requires establishing them and really following through, a commitment to follow through. Yeah, Scott, anything more about boundaries?
Yeah, no, I love that you brought up needs. I think it's a matter of finding out what your partner's needs are, finding out what your needs are, sharing them with each other, and then figuring out how you can create an environment where you can both get your needs met in a healthy way. And probably some compromise around that, but you know, maybe I need you to watch. I need to have less news on in the house because it makes you anxious. I don't even know how to word that one in a proper boundary language, because the boundaries are about me, not you. But you know, yeah, just find out what your partner's needs are and share your needs, and I think that'll help with the process of boundaries. So, okay. Next question, went to the Seeking Integrity retreat a few weeks ago. This is a couples retreat we have about once a month. And by the way, we are still open. The treatment center is open. And we have some couples workshops scheduled. But I'm not sure for when. So, but we have them if you want a couples workshop. Go to the Seeking Integrity website. Yeah. Anyway, this person went to the Seeking Integrity retreat for couples a couple of weeks ago, still trying to figure out how to work through this, even though the treat was amazing. You have recommendations for my wife and I to potentially use during this time period to grow and bond together without all the hard discussion? Great question.
Yeah, so I had to reread the last part about without all the hard discussion, because I think one of the things that is going to be really essential is really good communication. And you may want to sort of defer hard discussions, and I don't know where you're at in the process. And if there's a disclosure involved, that takes a while to formulate and plan and prepare. But I think it's just really important to take the benefit of this time. And there's always kind of a wonderful period of kind of grace after treatment, after a workshop like that, where we're open to change. And I think it's a wonderful thing to kind of make use of that time. And I would suggest just two things. One, really each of you being really mindful and just noticing your feelings, your reactions, because this is the kind of period where you have a different perspective on things, and yet you're going to drop into your same old routines. I think it's a wonderful time for a couple to kind of look at what they're doing, and there's an opportunity to change if it's not working for you or for either of you. So that's one thing. It's just to really notice things, be mindful, be open to feedback. But the other thing I think personally is just to really have a ritual of checking in with each other. And that might be morning and night, maybe once a day, and it doesn't have to be long and intense, but I think, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And I really like, when I do couples work, I have the couple sit facing each other and they hold each other's hands and make eye contact. And just that physical stance is really helpful, because it's people get fidgety and break the eye contact and kind of want to break the connection. So just starting that way, and then just sharing what's going on, what you're feeling. And there's a wonderful dialogue a lot of couples use from imago therapy, but in its very simplified form, it's just kind of really carefully speaking. So, and that starts with someone says something and the listener repeats it back and says, "Did I get that right?" And this is so basic, but it's one of the key problems that a lot of couples have, is they talk past each other. They don't hear each other. They're not they're not communicating effectively. And so just that simple act of, gee, you know, this is what I hear you saying. Did I have it right? You may not agree with it. It may sound crazy to you, but this is what your partner's saying. And if that's correct, then you can proceed. And maybe, gee, I can see how you would feel that way, or whatever you can do to empathize or establish a connection. But I think that checking in ritual is really helpful for people. Now, you talk about all the hard discussion. Again, a lot of this may need, the harder discussion may have to happen in the context of therapy, couples therapy, or with your therapist. I'm not sure the specifics, but I do think it's a kind of a magical period, or it can be. And I think just to really make use of it and stay connected, connected with verbally, with communication, connected physically, connected spiritually, you know, just that really feel each other and stay connected. And again, I think we're talking about not being alone in this space of isolation, but some of those same tools apply to a couple where you want to be kind and generous and communicate really, really well.
Yeah, just a reminder to everybody, ask questions using the Q&A feature. We've got a decent crowd tonight, but not very many questions so far. So ask us some questions. David, what about for a couple who's in the early stages of recovery, what about, you know, having a date night, you know, every other night or something, where you make a nice meal together and then sit down and play cribbage or watch Netflix or something like that. Even a non-sexual date night, if the relationship hasn't healed to the point where that's a good idea. Do you think that's useful, or might be too much?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea. There was the ability of a couple to collaborate and do something is really, really healing. And so, you know, preparing a meal or doing a project together or something fun, just as simple as sitting and watching a movie, a shared experience. That's what you're really trying to create, are shared experiences. And they can be really beneficial. And it doesn't have to be expensive or fancy or anything. It can just be an easy night at home, you know, with Netflix and the dogs or cats or whatever. Those are my favorite nights. So yeah, just something, some connection. And it doesn't have to be heavy and, you know, particularly meaningful. But I think just that idea of being connected is quite healing for people, especially if there's been, you know, an addiction in the relationship, and there's a lot of those feelings. And it sometimes comes down to reestablishing trust and vulnerability with these little tiny steps like that. Just little gestures can be really helpful. And learning how to collaborate. Now, I would be, you know, there are some things where couples have a lot of trouble. There was an interesting thing about predicting marriage duration, a study in England where they gave them a task of collaborating on, you know, assembling, you know, one of those 10-foot long bookcases that come in a tiny box from some furniture store. It's like the things that kind of make us all crazy. You might want to avoid stuff like that. But I think some project, if you have kids, doing something with the kids all together is incredibly healing for everybody, especially your kids. So I think, yeah, involving the whole family as best you can. And again, I don't know where you're at physically, you know, in the country, but you may find yourself spending more time than normal together. And so it may be a wonderful opportunity for you to kind of have some of those shared experiences and make this a memorable time and a time of healing.
And, you know, one of the things that Dr. Rob mentions in his book, Out of the Doghouse, is anything you can do that's specific to your wife or your partner is going to mean more than, you know, you could order a box of chocolates and have it sent from Amazon, but that's not really specific. But if your wife has, you know, a collection of ceramic pigs, you know, you know, you could find a ceramic pig and paint it yourself, or you know, ceramic. One of my neighbors collects ceramic pigs. So
no
anyway,
gift cards.
but yeah,
no gift cards.
Yeah, gift cards, not so personal, but yeah, make it personal and keep it light and fun, whatever it is, and it can just be small gestures here and there. I think are I think they go a long way as you rebuild trust, because trust doesn't happen again overnight. Oh, some additional information. Therapeutic disclosure happened prior to the couples retreat, and we are new into recovery 50 days. Congratulations. Decisions have not been made. The wife says she's trying to see where this goes, and couple therapy starts next week. Yes, great. So far, I've tried to use this time frame to cook together, play games together, and keep things light while building fun moments.
So you guys rock. You're doing it. You're doing it all. I think that's perfect.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, that's the way to heal. It just
totally,
takes time.
totally. And especially after disclosure, which is really hard. And I'm glad you had the benefit of the retreat after that. But, and the fact you're going to start couples therapy, I think, every couple can benefit from some guidance during this process. And so I feel really good about everything you said. It's really, you're on the right track, totally.
Somebody mentioned in the chat feature that there's a book about the 5 love languages. David, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I can't name them all, but basically it's a good book in that it talks about how we express love to the people that we care about. And so it may be that I'm not a very verbal person, but I love to cook. And so I express my love by cooking and imbuing love into food for people, for example. And so sometimes people who are receiving all that love in the form of wonderful meals and care are looking for something else. Maybe they're looking for it verbally or to be expressed in some other way. And people are kind of missing each other in the way they're expressing love for each other. So I think it's just a nice idea to really expand our understanding of how people express love for each other. And it may not just be as direct as we think it should be or in the form we expect, but to really kind of look at how people express love for us. And it may be in a way that is different than what we're thinking or expecting. And that's where sometimes miscommunication can occur.
While David was talking, I actually Googled this. The book is called The 5 Love Languages, How to Express Heartfelt Commitment to Your Mate. It's by a guy named Gary Chapman, Chapman. And according to Chapman, the 5 ways to express and experience love, which he calls love languages, are words of affirmation, acts of service, receiving gifts, I assume that also involves giving gifts, quality time, and physical touch. And all of those things can be done, now just as well as they could be anytime. Just saying nice things, words of affirmation, acts of service, getting up early and putting away the dishes that were in the dishwasher overnight, and not, just not even mentioning it. Gifts, we already covered that. Quality time, we've covered that, and physical touch. David, how do couples reintegrate physical touch when they're struggling in early recovery after a betrayal or multiple betrayals?
So I would say carefully. I think it has to be something for discussion. Sometimes people don't want physical touch. If there's a lot of hard feelings, or there's been a feeling of betrayal or trauma or mistrust, sometimes physical touch is the last thing somebody wants. I think eventually it has to be reincorporated if the couple is going to survive, obviously. But I think it's a matter of timing. And so again, it comes down to communication, discussion, dialogue. What do you need? What do you want? And how can we cooperate or collaborate to make that happen for both of us in the couple? So yeah, so I think first of all, we need to talk about it, and it comes back to boundaries too. What are the expectations? Again, somebody may not want the touch. Somebody may want to, I've seen couples when they're reintegrating, in that process of reintegrating touch, it was almost like an asking permission, just can we spend some time together now, or really to kind of integrate it in a way that's safe for everyone. And then slowly, I think, use your kind of innate sense of what's going on. But I also want to remind people that, our partners are not mind readers. And sometimes we go into a lot of assumptions, and we really need to check stuff out with the other person, because they may be on a totally different page than what we think they are. And that brings up one other point, is that in sex addiction recovery particularly, the rate of which people want to get back to normal really differs between the husband and the wife. In the case of a betrayed wife and a sex addict husband, where the husband, I think, once they get in recovery, really sincerely get it and kind of want their partner to know that they've turned a corner, they've changed, they've healed, they're ready to start kind of a new life together and want to get things back on track. And wives are often much slower to deal with that, to trust, to be open. And I think this is a case where we really underestimate the amount of trauma that our partners experience in the case of sex addiction. And that takes time to heal. And so I think we really have to respect the different rates or speeds at which people want to kind of get things back to a healthy state. It takes time. And it usually takes much more time than the recovering sex addict thinks it should or wants. And we need to really be patient with that and communicate our needs. So I think just, really, and I guess what I'm saying is respect for where the partner's at, respect for where everybody's at, and really honoring that to the best we can.
Yeah, and I would add that nobody ever died from lack of sex. So putting it on the shelf for a while, not really a problem. I've had sponsees say, "Oh, I'll have prostate problems if I don't have a regular orgasm." And one of them was a medical doctor, and I said, "Go find me the research. If you go find me the research that says you will have prostate problems if you don't masturbate, you can masturbate." He couldn't find any. So, nobody dies from lack of sex. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the practice of Tantra for gay men? Would you consider it to be healthy, possibly healing, or possibly opening up a can of worms, since I could see it turning into sex-seeking behavior, which could restart the wanting more syndrome, leading to relapse? I think this question applies to straight men and women as well as gay men, but if you see something specific to gay men, by all means, hit it.
No, I think you're right, Scott. I think it's more of a universal question for sure. I think Tantra is actually great. I think in terms of just expanding our idea of sexuality and intimacy, and it's a way of exploring. It is a way of exploring and really filling out in a much more complete way our body's experience of sensuality and intimacy. And so there's a lot of benefits from it. I think it slows everything down. It expands beyond just the orgasm, although orgasms are there. It expands pleasure centers to much more than we in this country kind of tend to focus on. So I think it's quite beneficial. Now, again, the timing of this. If you're a recovering sex addict or any kind of compulsive sex addiction issue, then I'd be cautious about it and maybe take it slowly. But I think in general, I've seen Tantra really have kind of profound impact on people in terms of just opening them up, making them more comfortable for interaction, for sensuality, for intimacy, and really helping them discover many different ways to be sensual, I'll say, and sexual. That said, again, I think we really need to examine if you're in any kind of sexual addiction recovery situation. I would definitely talk this over with your trusted advisors, a sponsor, therapist, friends, and get some feedback on this, because the whole situation can be very triggering. To bring it back to the gay issue, I know a lot of my gay clients have a lot of activity that involves groups or other kinds of things that may be very triggering. Just the situation, the setting may be triggering. Sometimes just a sexual setting can be triggering. Sometimes the act of a hookup can be triggering. So I think we'd have to take a look at kind of the structure in which this interaction occurs, which can also, the context of it can kind of be triggering in and of itself. So, with a lot of caution and with a lot of consent from people that you trust in terms of saying it sounds like a good idea, then I would consider looking at it. But with all those cautions. But overall, in general, if I weren't talking to a sex addiction or addiction crowd, I would be really much more enthusiastic, because I think it's really a beneficial thing to, especially for Americans, I think, to kind of broaden their ideas about stuff. But we have to be careful about addictive behaviors here. So.
Yeah, so the follow-up to that, is there a difference between Tantra groups versus one-on-one experiences? Where would one begin, with an experienced partner or in a group class?
Interesting. Yeah, so it just depends on the context. Tantra occurs in both settings. There are certified teachers and coaches that really know what they're doing. There are a lot of also people that kind of think that sounds cool and say they instruct tantric practices, and they don't really know too much about it. The kind of warning there, I think a lot of the instruction and experiential workshops occur with multiple people in group settings. And so that can be very triggering for people. But I guess there I would really check out who is providing the instruction, the coaching, the guidance, and make sure that they really know what they're doing. There are people that do, and there are a lot of people that don't. And so I'd be cautious about that. But again, in the context of this webinar with addiction Q&A, if you're going to explore that, I would think probably a one-on-one situation would be the best.
This is another follow-up question. I think this is to me saying nobody ever died from lack of sex. Actually, you bring up a good point. Is there any physiological concern for my husband if we are abstaining from sex? He tells me he needs to ejaculate, and I don't know if that's true or not. David, help.
Well, no, I'll concur with what Scott said. I think people think they're going to have a heart attack or die or have prostate issues or whatever, and our bodies are really remarkably resilient, and they can adapt, and they get by. And I think one of the old kind of stereotypes about sex addiction, we've all heard it in real life, is the guy that has to have sex 4 and 5 times a day because he's just that kind of a horny guy. And it's not about sex, it's about other things, and that's a real kind of compulsive outlet for managing uncomfortable feelings and avoiding things and dissociating. It's not about the sex, and it's really about a need to self-medicate. And so I think it is hard. It's terribly hard for people who have used masturbation to cope with stuff, but not necessarily sexual stuff, but for emotional things. And so if they stop that behavior, one of their major self-soothing coping mechanisms is taken away, and all that stuff starts to bubble up. So that's one of the reasons we really encourage therapy and support in this, because when we do stop that, and we understand that, addictions are ways that they're kind of maladaptive coping things. We deal with stuff in the wrong way. So when we take all those coping mechanisms that have a function to keep it at bay, they do start to emerge. And so people get uncomfortable. And I think that discomfort gets translated into this kind of anxiety that I'm going to be permanently damaged if I don't do this. And, our bodies adapt. Nobody died. I don't know of any serious medical complications from not ejaculating.
Yeah. Okay, this is a long question, but a really good one. So I'm going to read the whole thing. I want to connect with my wife, and I know that I hurt her in ways that I can barely imagine, especially since there were multiple times that I betrayed her trust after discovery. I'm more engaged and accepting of help than any time before. I've made a point of giving her everything she asked for as regards reestablishing trust. We are reading Hold Me Tight, a great book by Sue Johnson. We're going to couples and individual therapy, calling my accountability partner daily, refraining from porn, doing workbook exercises, and reconnecting with others. Recently, though, I feel that acquiescing to her needs for reassurance are getting out of control. It seems that there is always another litmus test for me to pass. The latest is that she wants me to sign over the house to her if I regress into my addiction. She wants this promise notarized by a lawyer or something. I want to know if this is too far, or is my addiction trying to hijack my thoughts. This is not a financial situation. She has a doctorate and a good job. I have a master's and an equally good job. What do you think, David?
Well, first of all, congratulations on all the stuff you're doing. You're doing an amazing amount of work, and that's terrific. Both of you are. It's really important. I think many times, I mentioned that partners, often betrayed partners, have a slower time frame for some of the recovery and the reestablishment of trust, and as a way of dealing with kind of their anxiety and concern and the repeated betrayals, and that's been the case here that you even cite some examples of. They're looking for a way to quell their anxiety, and often that manifests in the form of things like that. You know, the house or demands or little litmus tests, kind of prove for me that you're trustworthy. Some of those, are reasonable, but I think it would be important did you say you're in couples therapy? I think you did. But I think it would be important to have a discussion, and maybe it's something your wife would do with her therapist, but to really, what are the feelings underneath those demands? And to really, what's happening there? Because in my experience, when we get in that syndrome, you can hit a point where there's never enough. There's never enough proof. There's never enough reassurance. There's always that little moment of doubt or hesitation that creeps in, and you want another demand to see it through. And I think, does the recovering person have to acquiesce and meet those? Yes, they do, and you are. But at some point, like in this case, that may, given your situation, that may be perfectly reasonable. But I think it's important, for your wife's benefit at least, to have her really check out what's going on there, and will another test really help her feel better or not, or will there just be something else after that? And so I think that's the real issue that I worry about. Just, it's never enough, and it's not really solving the problem. So, and as I say, yes, we have to make gestures like that, and it's important. But I think it might be very beneficial for her to explore what's going on there.
Yeah, there's something under that request that, there's a fear, my cat clearly wants to play. Yeah, I think couples counseling is the place to discuss that. Yeah, I mean, that one, that's a new one. I've never heard that particular request, but I've heard similar requests.
I actually have.
Oh, have you? Okay.
Yeah.
So.
But I do want to underscore the fact, the list of things you say you're doing is terrific. I think it's just beautiful. And so, keep it up. You guys have a great start in your healing. And so I think this is something that's come up, and I would kind of dig underneath it, drop underneath that, or she should maybe, and see what's going on.
Yeah. This last little bit we've got here, this is a follow-up to the question about having a partner who needs to ejaculate, or says he needs to ejaculate. It says he was masturbating up to 5 times a day before we met. Is that normal?
That's not normal for male physiology. It can be somewhat normal for a sex addict who's kind of out of control sometimes. But, when I've had clients who just say, I just have a high sex drive, that's not normal. I don't know what
that's
the
not
standard
normal
is anymore. What
that's not normal
2.6
for a
orgasms a week or
boy.
something. Yeah, just, and it, even the youngest of guys in their prime, that's not normal. So to me, that's an example of a compulsive behavior that's kind of frantic, and really is all about something else, emotional, not the sex, and not the physiological need. Now, it feels that way to the man. I'm sure it does feel that way, because all those feelings have been translated into this sexual, it comes out as a sexual urge, but it's not.
Yeah, and comment as well. I'm the one in recovery for sex addiction. Yeah, I mean, 5 times a day, it's being used not as a sexual release. It's being used as a coping mechanism of some sort to quell anxiety, and he may not feel right if he's not doing that, but it's because he's not quelling his anxiety. You know, I mean, withdrawal from sex addiction is real. Just like withdrawal from alcohol and drugs are real. Alcohol and drugs are more physiological, sometimes with withdrawal, but you know, sex addicts, we get anxious, we get irritable, we get discontent, we feel like we're bored, or you know, we just feel like something in our life is missing when that coping mechanism goes away. And alcoholics and drug addicts experience that same thing. They just may have some other symptoms on top of it. So yeah. So anyway, we are out of time. Thank you everybody for joining us. It's great to get online and feel connected for a little while, or to be connected, I think is a more accurate. David,
Right.
Thank you again for being here. Do you want to wrap up just your little tips, just survival tips to take us out?
Yeah, so I started out just by talking about how to not be lonely, even though we might be socially isolating ourselves, we can still stay connected, emotionally connected. And that's just by enjoying being alone as opposed to being lonely, to imagine or conjure up images of people we really care about, living or dead, and really connect with them and even talk with them, but feel that emotional heart space when we connect with them. And then finally, just this practice of reaching out and being kind and generous via telephone, web, FaceTime, whatever works.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We will see you next Wednesday, same time, same place.
Thank you, Scott. Good night, everyone.